In today's video, we are diving into something that is front of mind for me right now as I work through my Saw by Top by Suzanne Mueller, and that is called rowing out. Today, we're going to talk about what it is, why it happens, what you can do to manage it, and what steps you can take to hopefully prevent it in the future. If that sounds like just your cup of tea, get comfy and let's dive in. Hello, 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 and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Midweek Ramble. My name is Taylor, and this is Gladys, and we will be your hosts. In today's video, Gladys is going to help me demonstrate something to you. Well, not really demonstrate, but show something to you that has become a little bit of, I don't even know if I want to say an issue. I'm not taking it as a negative thing, but it is something that I'm noticing with my Saw by Top by Suzanne Mueller. We are diving into the phenomenon that occurs in knitting called rowing out. I want to tell you a little bit about how this is impacting my project here, but I really want to tell you what it is, why it's happening, how you can manage it because it is something that you want to manage, and how even you might be able to prevent it in the future if you kind of know ahead of time that it could potentially happen in your project. Okay? These are important things to talk about because this deals with your tension and fabric texture as a result of your tension. It's kind of a big deal. Of course, your mileage may vary. You may or may not agree with me, but I am noticing with this particular project here, because it is all stockinette, it kind of is a little bit of something I at least want to talk to you guys about today. Okay, rowing out. What is rowing out? Rowing out is a knitting term used to describe long horizontal lines in knit fabric when it is knit with stockinette stitch. This is usually caused by a difference in tension between your knit rows and your purl rows. If you've been knitting for any length of time, you may be familiar with the fact that your knitting tension, meaning working your knit stitches, differs from your purling tension. Those differences between tension can create a sort of visual striping effect in the texture of your fabric when you're working flat, when you're creating stockinette fabric flat, where you're knitting one side and you're purling the other. Some rows just look a little bit more prominent than others, and it gives it a little bit of a ridged texture. Now, there are a lot of folks out there who will claim that their knitting tension and their purling tension is identical, and I love that for them. I think that's great. And a lot of times, the folks who claim this tend to be continental or Western style knitters. These are folks who flick or throw, I guess you will, with your left hand. However, the English style knitters or ones who throw or flick with their right hand tend to notice the rowing out phenomenon far more frequently. Typically this happens because the knit stitch, when you're throwing with your right hand, it tends to be a little bit more evenly and consistently tensioned, whereas when you're purling with your right hand, it's a little bit less consistent. There's more slack being introduced, more inconsistent movement in that direction around the needle, especially if that throwing motion is looser or just exaggerated. In contrast, continental knitters will notice a consistency between the knit stitches and the purl stitches because there's a lot less movement going on with the left hand as it takes the yarn around the needle, and the yarn is being fed from the same position for both the knit stitches and the purl stitches. So there's just more consistent tension between the knits and the purls. That said, anyone can row out. It really has a lot to do with your mechanics, how exaggerated your throwing or flicking is, and how consistent your motions are between the two different types of stitches. Kind of think of it like handwriting. In handwriting, and I remember this from teaching handwriting when I was teaching elementary school, some folks push more on their downstrokes and some folks push more heavily on their upstrokes. The style you learn influences your quirks, but habits and muscle memory ultimately shape that final result. Okay, so when does this happen? Where does it show up? And this is where I want to introduce my Saw by Top a little bit more clearly with you here. This tends to happen when you're switching from knits and purls, not, alternatively in one side of the fabric, but when you have knits on the right side and purls on the wrong side, typically when you're knitting something flat, because there is that distinct difference between one side of the fabric and the other side of the fabric. That's what's happening here with my Saw by Top. It's what happened with my Stripe Hype Pullover by Veronica Lindberg. It happens anytime you're knitting something flat and you notice it because you're seeing it in contrast to another section of the same project that is knit in the round. That is what's happening with my top here. So just to stay current, this is where we are here, and this is the one that brought this front of mind for me and ultimately why I'm sharing this with you guys today. When I started the Saw by Top, I knew going into it that the first portion of the project was going to be knit flat. So you are going to knit your front and your back flat, and then you're going to connect under the arm and continue the rest of the project and the round all the way down to the bottom. What happens here when you do this, just like we talked about, is your tension's going to change. You're going to have tension up here that is shaped by your hand mechanics and all of that when you knit one side and purl the other side. For me, I am an English style knitter. I tend to row out. My purling tension is far more loose than my knitting tension. I knew that going into this, okay? I knew that this was going to be a little different. And then when I added everything together down here to start my stockinette in the round, I also knew that my tension was going to change here because there are no purls happening down here. I don't have to flip those two different types of stitches. My mechanics stay the same. The more I do it, the more consistent everything becomes. And then this whole part of the sweater is liable to just be much more consistent and tidy than this whole part of the sweater. When I started this project, I was on a road trip with my family. I did not do anything to mitigate this issue. I grabbed my project, I took it with me, and I just started throwing caution to the wind and just saying, you know, it's fine. I'm just going to manage it as I go. I know this is a thing. I'll figure it out when I get there. Now, I know that's probably not great advice. It's not actually advice, but it is something that we tend to do, right? We just throw caution to the wind. Well, I'm telling you, when it comes to rowing out, it is something you really want to take into consideration because there will be a very noticeable difference if you have a tendency to row out between this section of the project and this section, especially when it comes to the gauge, right? The tension and the texture is one thing, but the gauge and the way it fits around your body is going to differ as well. This whole section up here will be looser. This will be more tight, particularly if you tend to have a more snug and consistent knit stitch when you knit in the round. Now, I do want to point out that this really isn't, you know, much of an eyesore. I'm moving this over so I can really see. You can look at this. The tension of the fabric looks actually really nice. My rowing out is there. It definitely is there. If I show you this really close without Gladys bumping into things, you can tell there is this ridged texture happening. If you look really closely, you can see a little bit of ridging happening or a little bit of rowing out happening there. But honestly, it's not a big deal. It really isn't a big deal. In my opinion, the rowing out in and of itself isn't an issue. It's when you have the rowing out in combination with a section of the garment that has none of it. Okay, it's that contrast that's where it becomes kind of a problem. It's like when you are knitting with a hand-dyed yarn and you notice a variation between two different dye lots. It's not a problem in and of itself if the dye lot of the yarn you have differs from the dye lot of somebody else's bunch of yarn, but it does become an issue that you have to work around when you have skeins in your batch from varying dye lots, right? You kind of have to mitigate those issues and have some strategies to work around it so that your fabric doesn't have real stark differences between portions. So in essence, in my opinion, the fact that I'm rowing out up here and there is a little bit of that ridge texture doesn't bother me. I don't consider that a problem. It was going to be a problem if I didn't do something about it when I got to the section where I was going to be knitting stockinette stitch in the round, because there would have been a noticeable difference. And I want to demonstrate what that would have looked like for you guys. I made a swatch. I didn't block the swatch. It's on a blocking mat just so I can show it to you, but I didn't block it. Now, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but what I did here, let me make sure I'm looking at this. Yeah, okay. What I did here is I knit this portion from about here to here in kind of like circular knitting. So I emulated circular knitting in my swatching. So this stockinette stitch that we get in this first bottom 2 inches down here is the kind of texture, tension I would get if I were knitting stockinette stitch in the round. And then this middle section about right here, this middle third, I did flat. So I knit one side and I purled the other side. This is what my stockinette looks like if I knit flat, making with no modifications, just knit one side, purl the other side, done is done. And then up here, I did something called combination knitting, and I'm going to introduce this to you a little bit later in the video. We're going to focus our attention right now just here. I want you to notice the tension here compared to the tension here. So I'm going to hold this up. My microphone is here, so I don't want it to be... I'm going to turn this just so the lighting makes it a little bit easier for you to see. Okay, so you might notice that if you're looking in the middle section here, that there is a difference in the texture in that area. I wish I had like a cool pointer. I'm going to use a pen. You might notice that the tension here is a little bit more loose and inconsistent than the tension down here at the bottom. Just kind of get a load of that for a minute and you can see. You might even be able to notice the ridges that appear up here, the rowing out that happens, and the lack of those down here at the bottom. Okay. And you're also going to notice too, even though we're going to get into it later, that there is a more consistent tension. I'm trying to do this without focusing on my face. That there is a more consistent tension at the top up here as well. You see that? So we have consistency, you know, not necessarily inconsistency, but just a little bit more loose, a little less consistency between the rows, and then consistency down here. This is knit, I don't know, I would say that this bottom section is a little bit looser than this top section, but this is definitely the loosest of all. Okay, I'm going to unpin this because I also think that showing it to you just kind of in its natural state makes this a little bit more clear. And I was kind of amazed, to be honest, at how noticeable it was. And this is why, to me, it's really important that you take this into consideration with a project like this one. Okay, so I'm just going to hold it up. I feel like you might be able to notice this area down here is what I did emulating circular knitting. I'm going to hold it like this. So this here is circular knitting. And then this area in the middle is traditional knit, the one side, purl the back side. And then over here is where I did combination knitting, which we're going to talk about in a minute. In fact, the combination knitting started, I don't know, like, okay, we're going to talk about it in a minute. I don't want to get into it too much. There is a little bit of rowing going on in the rowing out going on in the combination knitting. But what's important about the contrast between the circular knitting and the combination knitting is the tension, the gauge. Okay, the gauge is similar between these two, whereas with no modifications, no combination knitting, over here, it's a little bit looser. Okay, I don't want to dive too much into that. So it's something that you have to consider because there is a difference, and it is a difference that you're going to notice in an all stockinette project. It might seem pretty subtle right here, and blocking might solve your problems, but truly it's something you want to consider because for some of us, depending on our own personal tension, it may or may not be, noticeable. Okay, that's the point of this. Just letting us all know that this is a thing and it's something that we might want to consider. One thing that you can do, and it's actually the thing that I'm doing here, what I decided when I got to this point down here was instead of, fussing around too much or going up a needle size to make up for whatever happened over here, I decided to alternate rows between two different needle sizes. You'll see here that I've got two very distinctly different needles. I have a blue cabled needle and a red cabled needle. This is really important, otherwise you're going to end up using the same needle because they look exactly the same. I have two distinctly different needles here in two different sizes. I have one in the size that the pattern calls for, and I have one in a size up. And that size up is going to not replicate, but it's going to emulate what would happen on the rows where I would purl, which usually loosens my gauge up by a needle size. And so by knitting one round with one size and then the next round with the other size, I'm creating a similar texture to what's happening up here, and I'm getting a similar gauge to what's going on up here, and it makes up for the potential for the contrast, right? The visual contrast. I started doing this. I'm going to turn her to the side. Okay, so you can see how much I've done since I connected to knit in the round. So about 2.5 inches. And I don't know how easy it is to see. Here she comes again. You can see a little bit of that rowing out happening right here. And then when I pull this down, you'll notice that the rowing out stops. However, the gauge itself, the gauge of the fabric and the overall tension doesn't differ all that much. It's just more or less the texture that differs there. And I honestly don't think that combination knitting is going to eliminate the texture you get from rowing out, but it might make it so that the tension matches. So I can see, I mean, you can see right here and you can see here, there's a difference. However, because it's not cinching in down here, because the tension is not tightening up a whole lot because of the, more knit stitches, no purl stitches, it's not as visibly contrasty. Okay, it's very dark, or excuse me, very bright. I want to darken this up so that you can see it maybe just a little bit better. It is interesting. I mean, there is a noticeable textural difference between here and here. It's about right here it starts. You see that? But the gauge itself isn't off. It's a similar gauge. And some might say that this is just a deal breaker, that this is a problem. You can see a difference between here and here. And I say personally, as long as the gauge matches up, as long as you're not getting like this weird cinching in because all of a sudden you lost stitches, or like your gauge got tighter or something like that, as long as you don't have that, any kind of textural difference that you're getting up here, it's just the name of the game, really. It's just something that happens, and I don't think it's a deal breaker. I don't think it speaks to any kind of like lack of experience on the part of the knitter or quality of the work by any means. I just think it's something that happens. And as long as, like I said, as long as you can get your gauge to match up, then you're fine. And one way that you can do that is, like I said, alternate rows between two different sizes of needles, one the size that the pattern calls for and one a size larger, to kind of, emulate a similar tension that you're getting up here. Another thing that you can do, oh, and also too, somebody mentioned this, and this is a good point. If you're using interchangeable needles, like I have ChiaoGoo interchangeable needles, and the only reason I'm not doing this next technique is because I couldn't find my size 6 needle tips. I think they're occupied somewhere. But something else that you can do is you can put one size needle tip on one end of the needle and another size on the other end, and then what will happen is you'll automatically knit alternating rounds with different needle sizes. Okay, so combination knitting, what is that and how does it work? This is actually really interesting, and like I said, I tested it over here on this swatch. Now, like I mentioned before, English style knitters tend to have the rowing out problem more than continental style knitters, right? Because of the tension of the knits and the purls. Well, if you find that your purls are a little looser or unwieldy, as related to your knit stitches, something that you can do is change the way you throw the yarn around the needle. Combination knitting takes a little bit of style from Eastern knitting, a little bit of the style from Western knitting, and puts it together to help tighten up those purl stitches just a little bit to even out the tension. Okay, so the way that you do this, and I have a little bit of what's going to become a swatch to help build my muscle memory for this particular process. If you want to see the tutorial of me doing this, a little bit of a demonstration more than anything, I'll be popping this up over on the Patreon. But the way this works, it's the purl stitches where things start to get a little different, and you need to make up for the fact that your purl stitches are a little bit more loosey-goosey, unwieldy, poorly behaved even. So when you get to your purl stitches, and here we go with this, you will insert your needle like you normally do from back to front, but instead of wrapping your yarn counterclockwise around your working needle, you're going to wrap it clockwise around your working needle and purl your stitch. Ultimately, what it does is it makes it so that the tension between your flat knitting and your circular knitting in the sense of your gauge is the same. So you don't notice an overall shape difference between the areas that are knit flat and the areas that are knit in the round, which can tend to happen. The areas that are knit flat will bulge, where the areas knit in the round will be a little bit more svelte and streamlined because of the consistency. Okay, so I have done this whole row here where I have purled, wrapping the yarn around my needle clockwise. But this is the next step. This is something that you have to consider. Because you have just purled, wrapping the yarn around your needle clockwise as opposed to counterclockwise, you've twisted the stitch on the needle. You've adjusted the way the stitch sits on the needle. So when you go back to knit the next row, you're going to notice that your stitches look backwards. They look as if they've been twisted. They aren't, the front leg of the stitch sits further away from your working needle than the back leg, which means that now on your knit rows, you're going to knit through the back loop. You're not going to knit like you usually do because you have to work this as if it is a twisted stitch. So you knit through the back loop of the following row. Now doing this is called combination knitting because you're combining both Eastern and Western styles of knitting. I will put down in the description box just a really quick something to help you remember how this is done. It tightens the tension up a little bit, helping you to match the tension between your flat and your circular knitting. I did that here. I showed you a little bit already in the beginning of the video. The top portion of this, and it might be easier for me to hold it like this. I would put it back on the blocking mat, but I feel like I can kind of manipulate it better here and show you. This portion here where my fingers are moving, that was knit using combination knitting. Everything in the middle was basic flat knitting with no adjustments being made. And then down here, I knit just in the round like I would normally do. Rowing out occurs for me in both combination knitting and regular stockinette stitch flat. I see a little bit of rowing out happening over here and I see it happening in the middle. But one thing I noticed is that my tension over here, where I worked all knit stitches over here for the first 2 inches, and my tension over here, where I use combination knitting, are very similar. So by doing the combination knitting, I was able to achieve pretty much the same tension as I achieved doing all knit stitches. But there is a noticeable difference in tension between knitting flat, where I knit the one side and purl the wrong side, and knitting in the round, where I knit all of my stitches. I feel like there is a noticeable tension difference. So it's really interesting. It's interesting to me. Rowing out is a real thing. If you've experienced rowing out, let me know what you do about it down in the comments, because there's different ways that we can mitigate these issues. Using 2 different size needles and doing combination knitting, I feel like are the 2 best, the 2 kind of methods that I see used most often. Let me know what your preference is, because either one works, right? I just think that the one thing you don't want to do is leave it as is. You definitely don't want to knit the flat section with the same needle as the circular section unless you can be very certain that the tension is not going to change. And the one way that you can make sure that that's the case is to swatch before you do your project. It's very, very important. The final takeaways on all of this: rowing out doesn't make you a bad knitter. It doesn't make you a less experienced knitter. It doesn't mean anything about the quality of knitter you are. It happens to more people than more people are willing to admit. The only real problem is when you don't do anything about it and it ends up taking away from your project, making you not wear it as often, or causing you to just have that weird feeling in the back of your mind that something isn't right. Because you want to make sure you're knitting things that you love and not things that when you finish, you notice little quirks that throw you off and have it living in the back of your closet for the rest of its life. And again, if you would like to see me do a demonstration of combination knitting, head over to the Patreon. There's more content over there. It's a great way to support the channel. It means a great deal to me. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today. I hope this ramble was at least a little bit enlightening. I look forward to talking to you guys on Sunday's episode of the podcast, where I will have more to share with you on this project. Until then, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.